Good evening again. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society here at Fordham Law School. And welcome again to the HBO Theater for our post-screening conversation about HBO's Emmy Award-winning film, Recount. Joining me this evening for this discussion is the two-time Academy Award winner, Kevin Spacey. And of course, the very New York distinguished actor, Bob Balaban. Abner Green, Professor Abner Green at Fordham Law School will be portraying himself this evening. Let's just start off with, of course, Ron Klain and Ben Ginsberg. Let me just say that David Boies was scheduled to be here this evening. He is in Georgia, not the deep South Georgia, but Soviet Georgia, and he sends his regrets. And he was portrayed by Ed Begley Jr. What is it like to have been portrayed in a feature film like this? I'm speaking, of course, to you two. Do you think the portrayals were accurate? Did the actors follow you around at any period of time in order to get it right? And did you think that the film captured the experience that you lived through? Ron, let's start with you.
No, yes. It obviously it's very strange to have lived through this, and then very strange to watch a movie about 8 years later. To go to Thane's more theatrical questions, Kevin Spacey did not dog me around, did not follow me around. I don't think it's an imitation in any way, shape, or form. I met him once during the filming, but that's not any kind of impression to me. I think Ben and I, I think we both see the film the same way to this extent, which is that almost all of the dialogue and a lot of the specific anecdotes are fictionalized. It's not a documentary about what happened in Florida, and a lot of what you saw in the film didn't happen at all. But I think the big things, obviously, the major factual things are there. Obviously, the Supreme Court ruled what it did, the Florida Supreme Court ruled what it did. A lot of the courtroom scenes are based on actual transcripts and whatnot. And this is probably where Ben and I differ, from my perspective, there's a lot of the film I don't like, but I think what it gets across is the fundamentals of what happened in Florida in 2000, the disenfranchisement of minority voters, the failure of ballots to be counted, what I continue to believe is the unprincipled nature of the Supreme Court's ultimate decision in the case. And those big things are in the film. And so the fact that a lot of it is fictionalized around that, is a little bit of Hollywood dramatic license to get to the big things. So,
Ben?
Well, it was certainly flattering to be played by an actor who I think is the epitome of a sort of a cross between George Clooney and Brad Pitt. As for things generally, we won the recount. The Democrats won the movie, and I also think that's perfectly fair in the notion that this was a very good, compelling story, and I hope you all enjoyed it. But it should not be confused with a documentary. That there were, in fact, it was very exciting and fun to see in terms of it capturing, I think, a lot of the tension we felt in having to deal with the decisions. But the reality was, it was 36 days in which we all worked 18 hours on a good day, and it got encapsulated into 116 minutes. So a lot of the things that I remember from the recount and felt from the recount just sort of can't possibly be captured in a movie format. On the substantive level, and I'm sure we'll get into this a bit, I think the movie, I would disagree with a lot of the characterizations that were in the movie, both from a substantive point of view and really from a character point of view, but I'll save that for the...
Well, I'm actually interested, Ron, are there specific things in the film that you factually object to? And are there areas in which that you do feel that the film did a good job of capturing the experience of being as part of this being the head of this rapid response team?
Well, I think that, as Ben said, I think it captured the tension of the time. It captured, for those of you who are lawyers or law students,
surprisingly not many.
Surprisingly not many, okay. For those of you who know lawyers or law students, as a lawyer, you always want to work on an important case. And the thing about important cases usually is they take a long time to develop. And, this is a case where in 36 days we went to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, the Florida Supreme Court twice. We filed a civil complaint in the lowest state trial court in Florida and had an argument decision on the merits in the U.S. Supreme Court 11 days later. You don't often get that in litigation. So I mean, this, in the sense that you were obviously working on something that was a matter, next to capital litigation, as close to a matter of life and death as you can get, a matter of great consequence, where every day you really didn't know what was going to happen. I think the film really, captures that very, very well. And that, I think that's what Ben's talking about, the tension and the overall feel of the thing. I certainly agree with that. But the specific anecdotes. I mean, Jim Baker and I never met on a tarmac at the end of the recount. Okay.
Get a bloody nose?
I did get a bloody nose, but David Boies didn't do that. Someone else, another lawyer, did it. Well, for example, Michael Hooley, who is portrayed extensively in the film, Dennis Leary, never was in Tallahassee. Never was there once in 36 days. He worked out of Southeast Florida. He and I talked a lot on the phone. But he was down in Palm Beach County and Broward County. So I mean, a lot of the backstory here, and this is where Ben and I completely agree. A lot of the backstory here is kind of fictionalized and creatively so, and I think obviously it made it, at least I think, made it an entertaining film. But as Ben said, this is not a documentary about what happened in 36 days.
Artistic license or liberties in your world as well?
Yes. For example, the film doesn't discuss at all Bush versus Gore 1. In fact, there were two cases that went up to the Supreme Court. The first Bush versus Gore case really laid, I think, one of the major predicates for what the Supreme Court felt it had to do in its final decision. The U.S. Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore 1 sent the case back to the Florida Supreme Court. Florida Supreme Court ignored it. I mean, it is not every day that you find a state Supreme Court ignoring a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court, yet they did that here, and that has all sorts of consequences, I think, in the ultimate Bush versus Gore decision. Other realities, for example, the Pastor Whiting, who is portrayed in this book. If you read Jake Tapper's book, Down and Dirty, upon which the scene was based, Pastor Whiting voted that day. The film doesn't talk about the fact, it shows the Catherine Harris memo on the purge list. It doesn't show the statement that's also in that memo that says the decision on whether to use the list is left to the individual county and its officials. Well, Leon County is run by Democrats. It's a Democratic county. They chose to use the purge list in the way that they do. It's used in the movie to make a statement about Republicans. So there are licenses like that.
Yes, in Leon County, as the film noted, the supervisor, found that only 30 of the 900 names on the list were legitimate felons and struck those 30 and reinstated the others. All over the state, thousands and thousands of people were disenfranchised. Pastor Whiting did, in fact, vote. Ben is absolutely right about that, but lots of people never did get a chance to vote, and I think there's no question, probably one reason why there was a consent decree afterwards to abolish some of these practices in Florida. Many, many thousands of people were disenfranchised. I mean, look, when you have an election that comes down to pick your number, in my view, 154 votes, maybe 537 votes, even disenfranchising 1,000 people, particularly when they're African-American voters, was obviously outcome determinative here. I mean, a lot of things are outcome determinative here. So, I think what Ben and I can both agree on is we could sit here a long time, and he's not going to persuade me that Al Gore didn't win the election. I'm not going to persuade him that George Bush didn't win the election. And Ben and I are friends. We've done this many times, and I can assure you that's how this ends if it goes on like this.
It's like the movie. We know the ending already.
So, but there you go. I do. Well, the last thing I want to say about it is I think the other thing I hope the film gives you. I mean, again, someone who studies law, law can correct injustices, but it takes time. And our enemy in Florida wasn't Governor Bush, it wasn't his superb legal team, it was the clock. And the clock was ticking loudly. And you know, you talk to civil rights litigators, voting rights litigators, what they'll tell you is, oh yeah, I can fix things in court, you know, give me a couple years. And I think the pressure we particularly felt in Florida was, as long as we were behind and the clock was running, you know, we were up against it. And I think the film gives you some sense of that, and that was really what it felt like inside the Gore camp every day.
So it certainly got that part right.
Yes.
And I think something else it got right that's important is that you saw in the recount that the whole counting and casting process is very imperfect in this country. In reality, that happens in every election, in every jurisdiction, every time. You just don't see it unless there's something like a recount, and you especially don't see it unless there's a presidential recount. We do have a long-term systemic problem in the country about the sort of differential in voting machines that are used in the country, about casting and counting methods. We leave these decisions up to county officials, not even statewide officials. Each county in Florida selected its own machine. That's true in every county across the country. There therefore is going to be a lack of uniformity in the way individual ballots are cast and counted. That has all sorts of differentials on socio and economic lines. And there was at least an attempt in the Help American Vote Act to address that. The Baker-Carter Commission attempted to address that. There's a whole lot more that needs to be done.
You know, HBO has promoted the idea that the director of this film, Jay Roach, directed Meet the Parents, but it doesn't actually point out that the promotional materials don't sufficiently promote out that Jay Roach is better known for having directed all the Austin Powers trilogy, one of my favorite films. And it's interesting in a way because it really has, I'm sorry, it has a very similar narrative. Ben, of course, is number 2. Jim Baker is Dr. Evil, and Austin Powers. Same kind of perspective. There is a kind of perception of good versus evil here. And I'm wondering, you know, Ben, do you see that film? Do you feel that the perspective of the film is harsh on the Republican Party?
Hi, my name's Ben, and I'm a Republican.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, but there is such a thing as artistic license. I think it was, and the HBO folks are all pretty candid about saying they felt it was a more compelling story to look at this from the Democrats' point of view. I suspect the demographics of the HBO audience might just have a tad to do with that. Hollywood, of course, is Republican-friendly ground, so it couldn't possibly be that. But yeah, I mean, the movie was not and didn't try and be a real chess match between the two sides.
So, Ron, I can say groovy baby, groovy to you, but it is really your movie. It's really about you. It's from your perspective. And I'll tell you what I saw in the film that I hope I don't put you on the spot here.
I think you already have.
I have. It seems that there is an underlying idea here that there's a nuanced love story, a buddy film, the relationship between you and Vice President Gore. It's clear in the film that you had been fired from a position that you were deserving of continuing on in that very compelling scene. I don't know if that took place with you in Daly when you say to him, look, this is the position I was in 8 years ago. And yet it does seem as if the hope on some of the narrative force of the film is to vindicate your relationship with the vice president. And I'm wondering how much of that was really true. Is it because you had this deep affection for the man, or you believed in constitutional democracy, or you wanted to prove the campaign team wrong, that you should have played a bigger role in the campaign? So I have you on the couch in front of everyone in the HBO theater.
Yeah. So among the scenes that never took place in the film is the scene where I'm in the bar with Michael Hooley and I say I don't even like Al Gore.
That didn't take place.
That did not take place. So, you know, I mean, I think it's inevitable when you make a film like this, you compress the actions of hundreds of lawyers into a handful of people. And a lot of what Ron Klain does in this movie are things that a lot of people did. These are inside our camp, I think probably also inside their camp, somewhat composite characters. We had 100 brilliant lawyers working on something. Larry Tribe argued the case for the Supreme Court. Larry Tribe never even appears in the movie. So I think this is personalized in a way that doesn't really reflect reality. That said, I believe that we were fighting for the cause of justice in Florida. I believe that every day I was down there. I believed every single day that Al Gore won the election, that if our voting system had not been corrupted, if illegal things had not been done, if there had not been illegalities in the way those votes were tabulated, Al Gore would have been the president. And so I did think we were fighting for a cause that was right. And I think that what that little scene about me saying I don't even like Al Gore was about was to try to make the point that I think for everyone inside our team, this was really not about Al Gore per se, and we all had different relationships with Gore, some closer, some less close, but we really believed we were fighting for the right of votes to be counted, the right of voters to have their votes counted, and for a democratic outcome in Florida. And we saw it that way, and so I think the whole personalization of it is a bit of a fictionalized thing. To me, it was much bigger than Al Gore. It was much bigger than anyone in the movie. It was about having the candidate who got the most votes win, and Al Gore got the most votes, and he should have won. So that to me is what it was about.
It does seem like it's screaming for a sequel, Gone Fishing with Gore, that you have this new relationship with him. Was Monica right? Did you get a job again?
I did, fortunately. I did indeed work again.
But you looked miserable there in Warren Christopher's in that conference room.
Again, highly fictionalized.
Okay, I just wanted. You didn't like being a lawyer in that firm again.
No, I went back to Melvin Myers. I was a partner there for 4 years.
But you were not miserable.
So I was not miserable. But again, I think this is just part of the whole literary license thing of trying to turn this into, a little more of a thing. To me, it was a fight for a cause that I believe it was just, a candidate that I did passionately believe in Al Gore. And as a lawyer, the greatest piece of litigation you're ever going to work on in your lifetime, times a factor of 10. And the fact that we were up all day and all night writing all kinds of appellate briefs, as Ben said, as sometimes when I see the film, I think the litigation seems long and tedious. As long and tedious as it was, that's only 1/30 of the litigation that was actually going on in Florida. If you like litigation, you like being involved in that, there really was no greater challenge ever.
Abner, we're going to have you play the role of a constitutional law professor, which you can do ably. For many people in the room who it's been 8 years, can you give us a brief tutorial? You did write a book, Understanding the 2000
I just happened to bring it with me here.
He's the author of a very fine book, Understanding the 2000 Election. Can you give us remind us what are these legal issues? What is it that we saw?
Well, one thing I wanted to say, which is partly by way of a question, is that one thing that I felt the movie captured quite well, not having been there on the ground, but having watched a lot of the TV reports, is what I would call the chaos involving the counting of these ballots. And I don't just mean the situation in Miami-Dade with the Republican operatives. I mean the general chaos of hand counting ballots. I mean, if you think about it, it's a pretty imperfect science, having to hold these up and figure out what counts as a vote and what doesn't. And it's something that Ben said that I think I agree with, which is that our voting system is highly imperfect. And thinking about it this year also and what challenges might arise. It strikes me, and this may seem obvious, that we can send a man to the moon and make amazing computers, and yet we can't come up with, at least for presidential elections, a uniform national voting system that will reliably count votes. I mean, I think a lot of us agree with that, and whether that will happen remains to be seen. I think the movie does actually for a film that is partly fictional and partly real, I think it does a very good job of conveying for a lay audience what some of the legal issues were. I mean, I think the issues about the dispute within Florida, about when you have to recount votes and when you can't recount votes, was well handled, about whether to extend the recount. There are some complexities there the film doesn't deal with, but it at least approaches it. I think one of the big issues that the film touches on a little bit that I think ultimately was the key issue here was the lack of uniform standards for counting. That ultimately is at the core of the Supreme Court opinion. And I have to say that as a Democrat and supporter of Gore, when I first heard this happening in the first days after the butterfly ballot issue sort of subsided and the hand counting issue came up, and there was first there was a separate litigation that the Republicans and other voters filed in district court that ended up going to the 11th Circuit. I thought my constitutional instincts, not as a Democrat so much, were the red light started flashing. I thought, they got how many different counties? 67 different counties. The way Florida law works is each county canvassing board has the power to sort of decide how to count votes. The state statutes just talk about voter intent. They don't specify what voter intent means. The state Supreme Court never during this entire course of litigation would specify what voter intent means. David Boies was put to the test at the Supreme Court and sort of fumbled a little bit initially and said, well, it should just be count every vote. And this was an enormous problem, I think. And so when the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that there was an equal protection violation by giving each county the sort of discretion to decide how to count votes, I thought it wasn't a totally crazy ruling, although it was coming from people who generally didn't support equal protection theories. The other half of the case, which is very hard to capture in a film, which the film tries to capture a little bit, is even if there's a violation of equal protection, why not send it back to Florida for establishing a uniform standard and further counting? And that had to do with this deadline of December 12th, which I can't even talk about tonight. It's very complex. Suffice it to say, a lot of us believe the court dropped the ball on that in fact it could have been sent back for further counting pursuant to a uniform standard. But overall, I thought the film did actually an excellent job with some hard issues.
But despite your personal politics, you have written that you think that the Supreme Court actually had a legal basis.
I have written that I think that the holding that allowing counties to allowing these county, who are these county commissioners? They are elected officials. They're judges who are often elected judges, and they are having the power in each county to decide: are we going to count dimpled chads, or are we not going to count dimpled chads? Are we going to count hanging chads, or are we not going to count hanging chads? And we have a whole line of cases, in fact, in the free speech and free press area, where we don't let local elected officials make these sort of discretionary decisions about when are you going to get a parade permit, when are you going to get a meeting permit for Central Park. We insist on more objective standards. And so the fact that Florida allowed all these local elected officials to decide what counts as voter intent, I thought was a legitimate constitutional problem. I don't know if Ron agrees with me on that or not, but
So I unfortunately have to leave.
Well, we're going to take one question.
But I want to respond to that, and then Ben is going to get the last word in a big time way here. Here's my view on that. If in fact Bush versus Gore is a serious piece of constitutional decision making, and if since then we had prohibited this unequal counting of votes, I'd be prepared to accept it at face value. But the fact of the matter is, 8 years later, this still goes on. 8 years later, ballots are tabulated unevenly, and as Michael Hooley points out in the film, where these cheaper, less reliable voting systems are overwhelmingly minority communities around our country. And apparently that hasn't violated the Equal Protection Clause ever again, not once, except on the 12th of December of 2000. Now, that to me is my problem with taking this opinion as anything other than a political exercise by the Supreme Court. Because if the Supreme Court were serious about it, we wouldn't have these same lousy, unreliable voting machines that black voters are going to go face, in 18 days, 8 years later. And so that is my problem with saying, well, this was a real equal protection deal. Now, more intellectually and fundamentally, the big problem here is that when you run an election in 2000, and you have at least 4 different voter systems being used in the state, and the systems are inherently unequal, anything you do is going to be unequal after that, because the inequality happened on election day, where some people had OptiScan systems, some people had punch cards, some people had machines, all kinds of different things. And so now you're trying to fix something that's always going to be uneven. The voters who voted with OptiScan had an error rate significantly lower than the voters who voted with punch card ballots. And so any remedy that comes later is going to be subject to the thing that impacts voters differentially. And and this is where Ben and I agree, you really, if you want to take the issues here seriously, you have to fix our electoral system on the front end. Anything you do afterwards is merely kind of stopgap and uneven. The last thing I'll say is, I used to get emails every day while we were in Florida, and every day I'd get an email that went something like this. Dear Mr. Klain, I'm a PhD in political science. There were 6 million votes cast in Florida. You either won or lost by 1,000. Don't you know, as a statistical matter, Florida was a tie, and there's no conceivable way to find out who won in Florida, because statistically it's a tie. And I would always write back, okay, you call Mr. Baker and tell him, let's split the electoral votes evenly, and we're prepared to live with that on the Gore side. We'll even give them, 13, we'll take 12, because we're 4 away from winning. And the point of that is that after the election, there were only imperfect, uneven, horribly bad choices. And, again, I thought we were on the right side. I thought we should have won. But what I do think is fair to both sides is both sides were trying to grope their way through a system that really wasn't built to deal with this sort of thing, that could not really be fixed after the fact, that didn't have the right procedures and laws in place to really have a fair and just outcome. And almost any outcome in Florida would have had some sense of arbitrariness to it, however it came out. Right. So, that's kind of my take on it.
Ron is going to leave soon. I just want to make sure before he goes, do we have a quick Ron Klain question? Yes.
Florida was such a Republican state back then. Florida was such a Republican state. Do you really think that your efforts would have, that there was any way you could have won, even if you won in the courts? That they would have figured out a political split?
Yeah, that is a great question, which is, the film kind of touches on this, which was that even if somehow we had gotten ahead in the count, would Catherine Harris have ever certified our victory? Would we have had to have her thrown down to Guantanamo and tortured to get her to sign a certification? The state legislature had indeed started to pass their own casting electoral votes. We would have had to get that set aside. The certificates had already been sent to Washington. We had to get the certificates pulled somehow. I mean, there were, even if we won on any given day, there were many, many obstacles to turning that win into an actual victory. I think there was no question by the time we got to December 12th, with one set of electoral votes already sitting there at the archivist, if we had gotten a second set sent there, how they would have gotten counted. I mean, that would have been a true constitutional crisis if you had 2 sets of electors sitting,
But Ron, if I remember correctly, if you did the recount and if Gore pulled ahead, I think your guys' notion was that would give you a really good chance of winning.
Well, early on we certainly felt that way before the certification.
Being ahead helps.
Before the certification, but I mean, post-certification, look, we were definitely rolling the ball uphill big time. I said jokingly to people afterwards, if you're ever going to tie an election again, don't do it in a state where the candidate's brother is the governor, where his campaign chair runs the electoral process. It's like that's not where you want to tie it. You want to tie it someplace else. So, we definitely have a lot of things against us. It is what it is. Michael Hooley says at the end of the film. All right, I've got.
All right, he's got to run. Ron Klain, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks for coming so much.
Thank you, Ron. Ron is, we're still here. We're not going anywhere. We've got another 10 minutes or so. Travel safely, Ron. Thank you.
Can I ask Ben a follow-up based on Ron's last comment?
Yes.
As you know, states have governors, and they're usually Democrats or Republicans, and the Secretary of State is usually Democrat or Republican. So every state's going to have this. I mean, for example, this year in Ohio, the governor is Democrat, the Secretary of State is Democrat. That's been making a difference if you're following some of the Ohio litigation. It was otherwise 4 years ago. What's your sense about how much the fact that Republicans controlled some of these key offices made a difference in 2000?
Well, I find this one of the great conspiracy theories of this recount. I mean, first of all, as a general rule nationwide, each state has sort of a different system. So having the governor or having the Secretary of State may or may not matter in an individual state. In Florida, the reality is clearly the Florida Supreme Court was not Republican in any way, shape, manner, or form, and reversed the rulings of 2 trial courts in a matter that was very helpful for the Democrats, not a Republican move. The counting was all done by individual counties. There was a reason that the Gore campaign initially asked for a recount in only 4 counties. Those 4 counties were the foremost Democratic counties in the states. All of the counting boards were dominated by Democrats. They wanted the intent of the voter standard, which is a truly subjective standard in the way it was implemented. The reality is that if the recount had continued and we had had to appeal the results of the recount, we would have been able to show a huge volume of precisely similar ballots counted the same way, not only between 2 different counties, but within Broward and Palm and Dade counties and Volusia, where the tallies given by the judges on whether a voter's intent through a dimple or a chat existed was clearly outcome determinative based on party affiliation of the county officials. So I take the point that it felt alien to have Jeb Bush as the governor, and it was helpful in some ways, like finding really good lawyers. He had no role in the election process. He excused himself from the state canvassing board. Catherine Harris, if the Democrats had gone ahead, would have had to have certified Gore, because that's a mandatory action based on the certificates of each county. So I mean, ultimately, I'm sure it felt alien. The Attorney General of the state of Florida was Gore's campaign chairman. And the Attorney General of the United States, for what it was worth, was Janet Reno, a Democrat from Miami.
One interesting tidbit on this, for those of you who are like little legal tidbits, is that if the election had ended up in Congress, there's an Electoral Count Act of 1887. It's very complex, but there's one scenario. If there had been one slate certified by, say, the courts for Gore, and another slate certified, say, by the Florida legislature for Bush, and there had been a sort of standoff in the Congress, if you sort of look through the Electoral Count Act, it says, the one that is ultimately signed off on by the governor of the state shall prevail. And I have a line in my book that says, and under that scenario, Jeb Bush could have delivered the state for his younger brother, but obviously we didn't get to that.
We never quite got there.
We're going to take some questions, but first let me ask one more question for Ben and Abner. We have an election coming up in 18 days. If we required, God forbid, another recount, 8 years later, I mean, you've written about this, Abner, you've lived this, Ben. Are we further along in what we would do and how we would do it?
Well, I think truly the answer to that question would depend on if we had to go to a particular state, where was that particular state? I think that probably as a whole, as I think is pretty evident, there are still a lot of problems in the casting and the counting of ballots in the country. It is, if nothing else, a system that is propelled largely by volunteers, and most of them are pretty elderly, truthfully. So there are strange things that happen in polling places every election, every year. And if there are some states that have well-developed recount laws, and some that have ones that are designed for local recounts, which is what Florida's was, and there are real difficulties doing anything statewide. So I think it depends.
Yeah, part of the problem here is that there are some federal standards set by both the Constitution and the U.S. Code for presidential elections. Then you have 50 states plus D.C., 51 jurisdictions, and there often is a failure of meshing from a state's general election code. For example, these deadlines, the December 12th sort of safe harbor date and the ultimate December 18th in 2000 date for the Electoral College to meet, those were deadlines from federal law that were running into sort of state procedures, and there was like this clash of can you do the recount and can you get the contest done? And that's just because the laws are written for different purposes, and we have very little opportunity to try to reconcile them. So
yeah, they're written for state recounts because no one can conceive of a presidential recount.
Right.
Let's take some questions. Anyone? Yes.
I wonder if you can comment on the legal challenge that's happening in Ohio and what we're in store for with those 600,000 new.
Well, did you see today's news on this?
Should I repeat the question?
So I'll give a brief answer to this. Help America Vote Act, passed after 2000, provides a number of different things. There's one provision that says something like the Secretary of State of each state shall sort of reach an agreement with the Director of Motor Vehicles for each state to try to make sure that the registrations match properly in terms of identification, address, et cetera. It's a little bit unclear what that provision requires of the Secretary of State. The Ohio Republican Party filed a lawsuit basically requiring them to upgrade their software to make sure that names and registrations that don't match could be sort of identified and sent to each county. Each county would then decide sort of what to do with that. There wouldn't, some of those voters might eventually have to vote by a provisional ballot rather than the actual ballot. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals voted for the Ohio Republican Party, basically saying, yes, Secretary of State, you've got to go ahead and do all this stuff and send all this information to the counties. And today, the U.S. Supreme Court 9-0, or at least there was no registered dissent, overturned the ruling of the Federal Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, lifted the temporary restraining order on Secretary of State Brunner in Ohio. And so this gets very complex, but that's
they did it on a technicality. They did it based on the fact that the suit was brought by the Ohio Republican Party, and the ruling was based on the fact that under the Help America Vote Out law, you have to have an individual plaintiff actually bringing the case. So it wasn't on the merits of the ruling. It was on a real technicality. Now that gets into kind of interesting questions about lawyer competency and how did the Sixth Circuit miss that particular issue.
But there again, look, there are lawsuits filed all over the place. I mean, the GOP in Pennsylvania is filing a lawsuit against Acorn alleging voter fraud, and they want, this Acorn, there's a lot of litigation going on, and I think the question will be, and maybe Ben agrees with me, and if one of the two candidates is ahead by a substantial enough electoral vote margin, it's not going to matter. If it looks like another 2000 where Florida matters, or 2004 where it was still pretty close, then we might well see litigation depending on which state is involved and sort of what's going on in that state.
Litigation is always an option for the candidate who's in second place. I mean, the reality is there is a lot of litigation that goes on around elections now. It's fraud versus intimidation. It's really two sides of the same coin. It's sort of leached into the water supply so that it almost factors into the get out the vote messages of each of the parties. You know, the other guy's trying to cheat, you better come out to vote. We're actually in a pretty bad place in the country because the reality of fraud versus intimidation is sort of the racial tension in the country, and we don't talk about that, and it manifests itself in this debate that comes up around elections, and it really is today, and this is the fault of both parties, I think, far too rooted in the desire to get out your base vote.
But did the election of 2000 set a dangerous precedent that we now have almost, not an expectation, but an understanding that the courts would be invoked in order to decide the elections?
Litigation has been taking place every 2 years on a regular basis since I got first, it was going on before this. I first gotten hauled into court when I was counsel at the Republican National Committee back in the 80s, and it's happened every year. I think 2000 in the recount put much more of a popular focus on lawyers as participants in the election, which was kind of fun for our egos, but not necessarily good for the system.
But always true. Yes?
Hi, Nadine Johnson. I am an attorney, and I teach law and popular culture at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, as well as work in the criminal justice system. I thought it was a great movie, very entertaining. I didn't see it the first time because I thought it was going to be really boring. So I thought it was more of a documentary, and I think it really, for lay people and for students, it really conveyed a lot of the legal concepts. You made a statement that the candidates in second place can always, litigation is always a resource, but the way the movie portrayed it, they portrayed the representatives of Bush initiating litigation. Was that because they thought that the folks who were in power would be more favorable, or did they get it right on that, or give us a little insight on that?
No, first of all, the first litigation filed was not actually the litigation that was talked about in the movie, that there had been litigation filed by the Democrats in a number of counties. on, I think, almost the Thursday after the election. So that the litigation that was filed by the Democrats was in state court. We were indeed worried, as the movie portrayed about Secretary Baker, about what the Florida Supreme Court would do, so that we filed an action in federal court on the equal protection grounds on, I guess we filed it on Friday and it got heard the first Monday. But it was in response to the fact that the Democrats were saying count all the votes, and the sequence of the protests with the butterfly ballot and Jesse Jackson was accurate. And they were saying count all the votes, but they were only asked for a recount in the four most Democratic counties in the state.
But the state, to be fair, the state law didn't, I mean, the state law said you should ask for recount in each county, right? Isn't that how the state law is?
Sure, but we didn't fire the first litigation
Right.
bullet.
But the fact that they picked those four counties was perfectly within their legal rights to do, correct?
Oh, sure, it was within their legal rights to do, but any recount is a combination of law and public relations.
That's right.
And if you're saying count all the votes, but you're only doing it in 4 of 67 counties, that's not the universally desirable. I mean, you want to say count all the votes, that sounds great. Everybody's for counting all the votes. Why'd they only file
And
in
certainly,
four
I mean,
counties?
and in the movie, the Ron Klain character at the end says maybe we should have asked for a recount in all the counties, and that's obviously something that they maybe should have done.
I think that they would universally agree on that.
All right, let's take
They
a
would
last.
have, by the way, they didn't because they know they would have lost if they had done that. Oh, add them up. Look at the media recounts. Oh, no, 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 no. There was a reason for that.
All right, sir, we'll take you as your final question for the night.
Looking ahead 4 years or 8 years from now, do you think?
We can hear you fine.
We hear you, it's fine.
The question is about a national voter card, and if that might resolve some of these historical problems with the voter registration and the reasons that voter registration is the way that it is today based on the history of that process. If we just change the system entirely, I think that would work.
I'm not sure I know what a national voter registration card
It would
is.
be a card where everyone has a card for voting in federal elections. I don't know either, it hasn't been developed yet, and people who couldn't vote might then not be able to vote for whatever reason, but everyone would have the.
Yeah, so let me tell you what I think about this. You know, the court decided last year, this case from Indiana, about requiring certain forms of voter ID and whether that violated the Constitution. The court held, I think it was 7-2, it was not a 5-4 vote, that it did not violate the Constitution. The concern was, I mean, part of the concern was that the Republican Party had pushed it for partisan reasons, but put that aside for a moment, that the concern was that this was going to disenfranchise poorer voters, mostly voters of color, who would have trouble getting these cards. I actually agree with that if we could come up with a system so that everyone, when they reach the age of 18, could get a card that could somehow identify them as a citizen, resident of a certain state, having reached the age of 18, that would be a beautiful way to proceed. And I do think that some of the problems with what's going to happen in Indiana and maybe some other states can be alleviated if the state makes it easy, provides several methods for people to be able to make sure they vote. If they have a driver's license, if they don't, if they have a utility bill, if there's some other way that they can easily get identified. So I would share that view. So sometimes you find the Democrats opposing it because of the concern about disenfranchising, but if it could be done properly and universally and uniformly, I think it would be helpful.
And I believe the Crawford case out of Indiana mandates more than a number of different ways to get the identification.
Right, in the Indiana state law, yeah.
So that will be administered by each state. I mean, I don't think it's a bad idea. My guess is it would run into a fair amount of political opposition, first of all from states who sort of cling to their prerogatives in this area pretty firmly. And secondly, because I think there would be fear on the part of Democrats that it would somehow disadvantage lower income individuals from getting the card. So I wouldn't look for it happening in 4 to 8 years.
I'm afraid our evenings are going to have to come to an end. Let me just give you a few house cleaning final messages. First of all, the Fordham Law Film Festival continues tomorrow night, not at the HBO Theater, but at Fordham Law School's McNally Amphitheater with the screening of Lenny, and the post-screening conversation will be with Floyd Abrams and Nadine Strawson. On Sunday at Fordham, the Fordham Law Film Festival's third screening will be The Paper Chase, and we'll have the novelist who wrote The Paper Chase, John J. Osborne Jr., Professor Paul Bergman from UCLA, who wrote a seminal book on the relationship between law and film, and of course our distinguished Dean Traynor. On Tuesday, we have the film The Confession with the screenwriter David Black. On Wednesday, we have Philadelphia with authors and cultural critics Alyssa Solomon and Mark Harris. And then finally on Thursday, we close out the third annual Fordham Law Film Festival with Adam's Rib. And we'll have Molly Haskell, longtime film critic for The Village Voice and The New Yorker, as well as Daniel Kimmel, who has written a more recent book on romantic comedies entitled "I'll Have What She's Having," which you know comes from from Harry Met Sally. We want to first thank our sponsors and longtime patron HBO for again hosting this lovely opening night at the film festival for Fordham Law School, and their ongoing support. Specifically, we want to thank their president Richard Plepler, and of course Deborah Rudolph, who's not here, one of our corporate affairs people, and then Moki, are you here? She's here. Moki, thank you so much, and Cindy, who I don't think is here. We're really very grateful for your support and kindness. Let's see. We should definitely acknowledge, Mara Williams is here. Was the original executive producer for the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. Mara, we're lovely to see you here. And of course, our present executive producer, Helen Herman. Nothing could happen without Helen. Thank you, Helen. As you can imagine, the work that we do here, the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society, it's really an astonishing amount of work, and Helen does most of it. Frankly, I just show up. On November 19th at the Time Warner Center, we're going to have another one of our Forum conversations, and that's with Sam Waterston from Law & Order. So there are still tickets available for the rest of the film festival. There are still some tickets, I think, for Sam Waterston, Helen. I'm not sure. But the way to do this is to go online to www.fordhamlawandculture.org. And if you're signing up specifically, registering for the film festival, it's fordhamfilmfestival.org. But everything is on fordhamlawandculture.org. Finally, we'd like to thank our distinguished guest, Mr. Ben Ginsberg, Professor Abner Green, and of course, Ron Klain, who's now on the Nacella, going back to Washington. David Boies was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, he's not. But thank you all for coming.
And if I could add, please, to Thane for putting this all together.